After nearly 100 years in an unmarked grave, a Rockford veteran is finally honored for his role in the America's bloodiest battle. As WIFR News reporter Sydney Stoffregan explains, this story is just a part of efforts to honor Winnebago County's unacknowledged soldiers.
Samuel Bogenreef is the only Civil War veteran buried in Rockford's Arlington Memorial Park, a cemetery founded just 2 years before his death. Fire! A cannon shot echoes across Arlington Memorial Park, a proper farewell for Samuel H. Bogenreef, who served with the 17th Illinois Cavalry during the U.S. Civil War.
Because he was a blacksmith, they made him a farrier, which meant he took care of the trimming the horse's hooves and taking care of the horse's shoes.
Bogenreef is the only Civil War veteran in Arlington, buried shortly after his death in 1929. His story remained untold until last year.
Our records had never indicated he was a Civil War veteran. When a group was tracking all the Civil War veterans that were buried in Winnebago County and trying to get markers for him, they called to confirm he was here and asked us to facilitate getting him his marker.
Beverly Krennick is the secretary for the cemetery. She says a newspaper article wrongly identified Bogenreef's resting place as Greenwood Cemetery on Auburn Street.
No one in his family or the GAR or anyone else had ever investigated getting a marker.
Bill Johnson, a member of the Sons of the Union Veterans of the Civil War, says it's important to remember these soldiers who reunited a broken country.
You know, these guys put out and changed the whole system in the mid-1860s. Not just slavery, but states' rights was a big part of what really was about.
Krennick tells me it's difficult to identify Civil War veterans due to the fact that many of them lack the discharge records that became a requirement after World War II.
Thank you, Sydney. And the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War hope to locate the final resting places of all Union Civil War veterans. To learn more, visit the National Graves Registration Project's website, and that link is at our website, WIFR.com.